So as you listen to me tell this story, just take a moment to allow your eyes to close and allow yourself to begin to relax. And I don't know whether you'll relax deeper to the sound of my words or the spaces between my words. Christmas Pantomime by Hugh Walpole. I'm sometimes inclined to wonder whether, in very truth, those Polchester Christmases of nearly 30 years ago were so marvellous as now, in retrospect, they seem. I can give details of these splendours, facts and figures, that to the onlookers are less than nothing at all. A sugar elephant in a stocking, a box of pencils on a Christmas tree, hark the herald angels. At 3 in the morning, below one's window, a lighted plum pudding. A postman 4 hours late, his back bent with bustling parcels. And it's something further, behind the sugar cherries and the paper caps and the lighted tree, that remains to give magic to those days, a sense of expectancy, a sense of richness, a sense of worship, a visit from the three kings who've so seldom come to visit one since. That Christmas of Jeremy's 9th year was one of the best that he ever had. It was perhaps the last of the magical Christmases. After this he was to know too much, was to see Father Christmas vanish before a sum in arithmetic, and a stocking change into something that boys who go to school never have. The last of the Christmases of divine magic, when the snow fell, and the waits sang, and the stockings were lifted, and the turkeys fattened, and the candles blazed, and the holly crackled by the will of God rather than the power of man. It would be many years before he'd realise that, after all, in those days, he'd been right. A very fat book could be written about all that happened during that wonderful Christmas. How Hamlet the dog caught a rat to his own immense surprise. How the Coles' Christmas dinner was followed by a play acted with complete success by the junior members of the family, and it was only Mr. Jellybrand, the curate, who disapproved. How Aunt Amy had a new dress, in which, by general consent, she looked ridiculous. How Mary, owing to the foolish kindness of Miss Ryle, the precentor's wife, was introduced to the works of Charlotte Mary Yonge, and became quite impossible in consequence. How Miss Maple had a children's party at which there was nothing to eat, so that all the children cried with disappointment. And one small boy, the youngest son of the precentor, actually bit Miss Maple. How for 2 whole days it really seemed that there would be skating on the pool, and everyone bought skates, and then, of course, the ice broke, and so on, and so on. There is no end to the dramatic incidents of the sensational time. The theme that I sing, however, is Jeremy's progress. And although even Hamlet's catching of a rat influenced his development, there was one incident of this Christmas that stands out and away from all the others, an affair that he'll never, all his days, forget, and that even now, at this distance of time and experience, causes his heart to beat roughly with the remembered excitement and pleasure. Several weeks before Christmas there appeared upon the town walls and hoardings the pictured announcements of the approaching visit to Polchester of Denny's Great Christmas Pantomime, Dick Whittington, Boxing night was to see the first performance at our assembly rooms, and during every afternoon and evening of the next 3 weeks this performance was to be repeated. A pantomime had, I believe, never visited our town before. There had, of course, for many years been the great Christmas Pantomime at the Theatre Royal, Drymouth, but in those days trains were not easy, and if you wished to attend an afternoon performance at the Drymouth Theatre, you must rise very early in the morning by the candlelight and return late in the evening with the cab, forgetting to meet you at the station as commanded, and the long walk up Orange Street, and the headache and the bad temper the next day. It happened naturally then that the majority of the Polchester children had never set their inquisitive noses within the doors of a theatre, and although the 2 eldest daughters of the Dean, aged 10 and 11, had been once to London and to Drury Lane Theatre, their sense of glory and distinction so clouded their powers of accuracy and clarity, they were no nearer, by their help and authority, to the understanding of what a pantomime might really be. I can myself recall the glory of those Dick Whittington pictures, just above Martin's, the pastry cook's, where they sold lemon biscuits, near the cathedral. There was a big wooden hoarding, and on this was pasted a marvellous representation of Dick and his cat dining with the king of the Zanzibar Islands. The king, a mulatto, sat with his court in a hall with golden pillars, and the rats were to be seen flying in the confused flood towards the golden gates, whilst Dick, in red plush and diamond buckles, stood in dignified majesty, the cat at his side. There was another wonderful picture of Dick asleep at the crossroads, fairies watching over him, and London town in a lighted purple distance, and another of the streets of old London with a comic fat serving man, diamond-paned windows, cobbled stones, and high-pointed eaves to the houses. Jeremy saw these pictures for the first time during one of his afternoon walks, and returned home in such a state of choking excitement that he could not drink his tea. As was ever his way, he was silent and controlled about the matter, asked very few questions, and although he talked to himself a little, did not disturb the general peace of the nursery. On Mary and Helen, the effects of the posters had been less. Mary was following the adventures of the May family in the daisy chain, and Helen was making necklaces for herself out of a box of beads that had been given her. When Jeremy said once, "Who was the man in the red trousers with the gold on them?" no one paid any attention save Hamlet, who wagged his tail, looked wise, and growled a little. Who indeed could tell how he ached and longed and desired? He had a very vague idea as to the nature of a play. They had often dressed up at home and pretended to be different things and people, and of course he knew by heart the whole history of Dick Whittington, but this knowledge and experience did not in the least force him to realize that the performance of Mr. Denny's was simply a larger, more developed dressing up and pretending. In some mysterious but nevertheless direct fashion, Dick Whittington was coming to Polchester. It was just as he had heard for a long time of the existence of Aunt Emily, who lived in Manchester, and then one day she appeared in a black bonnet and a shawl, and gave them wet kisses and 6pence apiece. Dick Whittington was coming, having perhaps heard that Polchester was a very jolly place. So might come any day Jack of the Beanstalk, Cinderella, Queen Victoria, and God. There were questions, meanwhile, that he would like to ask, but he was already a victim to that properly English fear of making a fool of himself, so he asked nothing. He dragged out his toy village and tried to make it a bridge in his imagination between the nursery and Whittington's world. As the village opened a door from the nursery, so might Whittington open a door from the village. He considered Hamlet and wondered whether he knew anything about it. Hamlet, in spite of his mongrel appearance, was a very clever dog. He had his especial corners in the garden, the kitchen, and the nursery. He never misbehaved, was never in the way, and was able to amuse himself for hours together. Although he attached himself quite deliberately to Jeremy, he did not do this in no sentimental fashion. And in his animosity towards the jam-pot, Aunt Amy, and the boy who helped with the boots and the knives, he was always restrained and courteous. He did indeed growl at Aunt Amy, but always with such a sense of humour that everyone except Aunt Amy was charmed, and he never actually supported the children in their rebellions against the jam-pot, although you could see that he liked and approved of such things. The jam-pot hated him with a passion that caused the nursery to quiver with emotion. Was he not the cause of her approaching departure, his first appearance having led her into a tempest of passion that had caused her to offer a notice that she had never for an instant imagined would be accepted? Was he not a devilish dog who, with his quiet movements and sly expressions, was more than human? "Mark my words," she said in the kitchen, "there's a devil in that there animal, and so they'll find before many years older. Hamlet indeed, an earthnish name, an earthnish beast." Her enemy had discovered that in one corner of the nursery there were signs and symbols that witnessed to something in the nature of a mouse or a rat. That nursery corner became the centre of all his more adventurous instincts. It happened to be just the corner where the jam-pot kept her sewing machine, and you would think, if you came to the nursery as a stranger and saw him sitting, his eyes fixed beamingly upon the machine, his tail erect, his body here and there quivering a little, that from dictates of manly devotion he was protecting the jam-pot's property. She knew better. She regarded in some undefined way this continued contemplation by him of her possessions as an ironical insult. She did everything possible to drive him from the corner. He inevitably returned, and as he always delicately stepped aside when she approached, it could not be said that he was in her way. Once she struck him. He looked at her in such a fashion that her flesh crept. She never struck him again. For Jeremy he became more and more of a delight. He understood so much. He sympathized. He congratulated. He sported, always at the right moment. He would sit gravely at Jeremy's feet, his body pressed against Jeremy's leg, one leg stuck out square, his eyes fixed inquisitively upon the nursery scene. He would be motionless. Then suddenly some thought would electrify him. His ears would cock, his eyes shine, his nose quiver, his tail tumble. The crisis would pass. He would be composed once more. He would slide down to the floor, his whole body collapsing. His head would slide down and rest upon Jeremy's foot. He would dream of cats, of rats, of birds, of the jam-pot, of beef and gravy, of sugar, of being washed, of the dog's Valhalla, of fire and warmth, of Jeremy, of walks when every piece of flying paper was a challenge, of dogs that he had known, of when he was a puppy, of doing things he shouldn't, of punishment, of wisdom, pride and anger, of love affairs of his youth, of battle, of settling down, of love affairs in the future, again of cats and beef and smells, again of Jeremy whom he loved. And Jeremy, watching him now, thus sleeping and thinking of Dick Whittington, wondered why it was that a dog would understand so easily without explanation the thoughts and desires he had, and that all grown-up people would not understand, and would demand so many explanations, and would laugh at one, and pity one, and despise one. Why was it, he asked himself. I know, he suddenly cried, turning upon Helen. It can be your birthday treat. What can? She asked. Why, going to Dick Whittington, all of us. Helen had, most unfortunately for herself, a birthday only a week after Christmas, the result being that, in her own opinion at any rate, she never received proper presents on either of those two great present-giving occasions. She was always allowed, however, a treat. Her requests were generally in the nature of food, once of a ride in the train, once even a visit to the Polchester Museum. It was different and difficult in those days to find treats in Polchester. "Oh, do you think they'd let us?" she said. "We can try," said Jeremy. "I heard Aunt Amy say the other day that she didn't think it was right for children to see acting, and Mother always does the opposite to what Aunt Amy says, so perhaps it'll be all right." "I wish Hamlet could go," he added. "Don't be silly," said Helen. "It isn't silly," Jeremy said indignantly. "It's all about a cat, anyway, and he'd love to see all the rats and things. He wouldn't bark if we told him not to, and I held his collar. If Aunt Amy sat next to him, he would," said Mary. "Oh, bother Aunt Amy," said Jeremy. After this, Helen needed a great deal of urging, but she heard that Lucy and Angela, the aforesaid daughters of the Dean, were going, and the spirit of rivalry drove her forward. It happened that the Dean himself one day said something to Mr. Cole about supporting a very praiseworthy effort. They're presenting, I understand, the proceeds of the first performance to the Cathedral Orphanage. Helen was surprised at the readiness with which her request was granted. "We'll all go," said Mr. Cole, in his general pastoral fashion. Good for us, to see the little ones laugh, good for us all." Only Uncle Samuel said that nothing would induce him. "I don't care what you do," Jeremy shouted. "You can tell anyone you like. I don't care what you do. You're a beastly woman." She turned upon him, her face purple. "That's enough, Master Jeremy," she said, her voice low and trembling. "I'm not here to be called names by such as you. You'll be sorry for this before you're much older, you see." There was then an awful and sickly pause. Jeremy seemed to himself to be sinking lower and lower into a damp, clammy depth of degradation. What must this world be that it could change itself so instantly from a place of gay and happy pleasure into a dim, groping room of punishment and dismay? His feelings were utterly confused. He supposed that he was terribly wicked, but he did not feel wicked. He only felt miserable, sick, and defiant. Mary and Helen came in, their eyes open to a crisis, their bodies turned sympathetically to the atmosphere of sin and crime that they discerned around them. Then Mr. Cole came in, as was his daily habit, for a moment before his breakfast. "Well, here are you all," he cried. "Ready for tonight? No breakfast yet? Why now?" Then, perceiving, as all practised fathers instantly must, that the atmosphere was sinful, he changed his voice to that of the children's Sunday afternoon service, a voice well known to his family. "Please sit," began the jam-pot. "I'm sorry to have to tell you, sir, that Master Jeremy not been at all good this morning." "Well, Jeremy," he said, turning to his son. "What is it?" Jeremy's face, raised to his father's, was hard and set and sullen. "I've told a lie," he said. "I said I'd cleaned my teeth when I hadn't. Nurse went and looked, and then I called her a beastly woman." The jam-pot's face expressed aggrieved and at the same time triumphant confirmation of this. "You told a lie?" Mr. Cole's voice was full of a lingering sorrow. "Yes," said Jeremy. "Are you sorry?" "I'm sorry that I told a lie, but I'm not sorry that I called Nurse a beastly woman." "Jeremy, no, I'm not. She is a beastly woman." Mr. Cole was always at a loss when anyone defied him, even though it were only a small boy of 8. He took refuge now in his ecclesiastical and parental authority. "I'm very distressed indeed. I hope that punishment, Jeremy, will show you how wrong you have been. I'm afraid you cannot come with us to the pantomime tonight." At that judgment, a quiver, for an instant, held Jeremy's face, turning it, for that moment, into something shapeless and old. His heart had given a wild leap of terror and dismay. But he showed no further sign. He simply stood there waiting. Mr. Cole was baffled, as he always was by Jeremy's moods. So he continued, "And until you've apologised to Nurse for your rudeness, you must remain by yourself. I shall forbid your sisters to speak to you. Mary and Helen, you are not to speak to your brother until he has apologised to Nurse." "Yes, father," said Helen. "Oh, father, mayn't he come tonight?" said Mary. "No, Mary, I'm afraid not." A tear rolled down her cheek. "It won't be any fun without Jeremy," she said. She wished to make the further sacrifice of saying that she should not go unless Jeremy did, but some natural caution restrained her. Mr. Cole, his face heavy with sorrow, departed. At the dumb misery of Jeremy's face, the jam-pot's heart, in reality a kind and even sentimental heart, repented her. "There, Master Jeremy, you be a good boy all day, and I dare say your father will take you after all, and we won't think no more about what you said to me in the heat of the moment." But Jeremy answered nothing, nor did he respond to the smell of bacon, nor the advances of Hamlet, nor the flood of sunlight that poured into the room from the frosty world outside. A complete catastrophe. They none of them had wanted to see this thing with the urgent excitement that he had felt. They had not dreamt of it for days and nights and days as he had done. Their whole future existence did not depend upon their witnessing this, as did his. During that morning he was a desperate creature, like something caged and tortured. Do happy middle-aged philosophers assure us that children are light-hearted and unfeeling animals? Let them realise something of the agony which Jeremy suffered that day. His whole world had gone. He was wicked, an outcast. His word could never be trusted again. He would be pointed at as the boy who told a lie, and he would not meet Dick Whittington. The eternity of his punishment hung around his neck like an iron chain. Childhood's tragedies are terrible tragedies, because a child has no sense of time. A moment's dismay is eternal. A careless word from an elder is a lasting judgment. An instant's folly is a lifetime's mistake. The day dragged its weary length along, and he scarcely moved from his corner by the fire. He did not attempt conversation with anyone. Once or twice the jam-pot tried to penetrate behind that little mask of anger and dismay. "Come now, things aren't so bad as all that. You be a good boy and go and tell your father you're sorry, or, well then, Master Jeremy, there'll be another time, I dare say. You can go to the theatre." But she found no response. If there was one thing that she hated, it was sulks. Here they were, sulks of the worst, and so, like many wiser than herself, she covered up with a word a situation that she did not understand, and left it at that. The evening came on. The curtains were drawn. Tea arrived. Still Jeremy sat there, not speaking, not raising his eyes, a condemned creature. Mary and Helen and Hamlet had had a wretched day. They all sympathized with him. The girls went to dress. 7 o'clock struck. They were taken downstairs by nurse, who had her evening out. Rose, the housemaid, would sit with Master Jeremy. Doors closed, doors opened, voices echoed, carriage wheels were heard. Jeremy and Hamlet were left to themselves. The last door had closed, and the sudden sense that everyone had gone, and that he might behave now as he pleased, removed the armour in which all day he had encased himself. He raised his head, looked about the deserted nursery, and then, with the sudden consciousness of that other lighted and busied place where Whittington was pursuing his adventures, he burst into tears. He sobbed, his head down upon his arms, and his body squeezed together so that his knees were close to his nose, and his hair in his boots. Hamlet restored him to himself. Instead of assisting his master's grief, as a sentimental dog would have done, by sighing or sniffing or howling, he yawned, stretched himself, and rolled on the carpet. He did not believe in giving way to feelings, and he was surprised and perhaps disappointed at Jeremy's lack of restraint. Jeremy felt this, and in a little while sobs came very slowly, and at last were only little shudders rather than pleasant and healthy. He looked about him, rubbed his red nose with a hideously dirty handkerchief, and felt immensely sleepy. No, he would not cry any more. Rose would shortly appear, and he did not intend to cry before housemaids. Nevertheless, his dissolution was supreme. He was a liar. He had told lies before, but they'd not been discovered, and so they were scarcely lies. Now, in some strange way, the publication of his lie had shown him what truly impossible things lies were. He had witnessed this effect upon the general public. He had not believed that he was so wicked. He did not even now feel really wicked. But he saw quite clearly that there was one world for liars and one for truthful men. He wanted, terribly badly, someone to tell him that he was still in the right world. And then, on the other side, the thought that Mary and Helen were at this very moment witnessing the colourful history of Dick Whittington, the history that he had pursued ceaselessly during all these days and nights. That picture of them all in the lighted theatre once more nearly overcame him. But he pulled himself together. He sniffed left his dirty handkerchief, and went slowly and sorrowfully to drag out his toy village from its corner and see whether anything could be done with it. After all, he was going to school in September. His punishment could not be quite limitless. Hamlet had just shown his approval of this manly conduct by strolling up and sniffing at the Noah family, who were, as usual, on their way to church, when the door suddenly opened, and in came Uncle Samuel. Jeremy had forgotten his uncle, and now blinked up at him from the floor, where he was squinting, rather ashamed of his swollen eyes and red nose. Uncle Samuel, however, had no time for details. He was apparently in a hurry. He did not wear his blue painting smocks, but was in a comparatively clean black suit, and on the back of his head was a squashy brown hat. "Come on," he said, "or we shall be too late." Jeremy choked. "Too late," he repeated. "You're coming, aren't you, to the pantomime? They sent me back for you." The room suddenly got on its legs, like the food and families during Alice's feast in the looking-glass, and swung round, lurching from side to side, and causing the fire to run into the gas, and the gas to fly out of the window. "I don't understand," Jeremy stammered. "Well, if you don't understand, in half a shake," said Uncle Samuel, "you won't see any of the show at all. Go on, wash your face. There are streaks of dirt all down it, though you were a painted Indian. Stick on your cap and coat and boots and come along." Exactly as one moves in sleep, so Jeremy now moved. He had once had a wonderful dream in which he had been at a meal that included everything that he had most loved: fish cakes, sausages, ices, strawberry jam, sponge cake, chocolates, and scrambled eggs, and he'd been able to eat, and had never been satisfied, and had never felt sick. A lovely dream. He often thought of it, and now, in the same bewildering fashion, he found his boots and cap and coat, and then, deliberately keeping from him the thought of the pantomime, lest he should suddenly wake up, he said, "I'm ready, Uncle." Samuel looked at him. "You're a strange kid," he said. "You take everything so quietly, but thank God I don't understand children." "There's Hamlet," said Jeremy, wondering whether perhaps the dream would extend to his friend. "I suppose he can't come too." "No, he certainly can't," said Samuel grimly. "And there's Rose. She'll wonder where I've gone. I've told her, don't you worry. What a conscientious infant you are. Just like your father. Anything else?" "No," said Jeremy, breathlessly, and nearly murdered himself going downstairs because he shut his eyes in order to continue the dream so long as it was possible. Then in the cold night air, grasping his uncle's hand with a feverish hold, he stammered, "Is it really true? Are we going, really?" "Of course we're going. Come on, step out or you'll miss the giant." But, he drew a deep breath. "Then they don't think me a liar any more." "They who? Father and mother and everyone. Don't you think about them? You'd better enjoy yourself." "But you said you wouldn't go to the pantomime. Not for anything." "Well, I've changed my mind. Don't talk so much. You know I hate you children chattering. Always got something to say." So Jeremy was silent. They raced down Orange Street, Jeremy being almost carried off his feet. This was exactly like a dream. This rushing movement, and the way that the lampposts ran up to you as though they were going to knock you down, and the way that the stars crackled and spluttered and trembled overhead. But Uncle Samuel's hand was flesh and blood, and the heel of Jeremy's right shoe hurt him, and he felt the tickle of his sailor collar at the back of his neck, just as he did when he was awake. Then there were the assembly room's doors. Jeremy having become so breathless that Uncle Samuel had to hold him up for a moment, or he'd have fallen. "Bit too fast for you, was it? Well, you shouldn't be so fat. You eat too much. Now, we're not going to sit with your father and mother. There isn't room for you there. So don't you go calling out to them or anything. We're sitting in the back, and you better be quiet, or they'll turn you out." "I'll be quiet," gasped Jeremy. Uncle Samuel paused at a lighted hole in the wall, and spoke to a large lady in black silk who was drinking a cup of tea. Jeremy caught the jingle of money. Then they moved forward, stumbling in the dark, up a number of stone steps, pushing at a heavy black curtain. Then suddenly bathed in a bewildering glow of light and scent and colour. Jeremy's first impression, as he fell into this new world, was of an ugly, harsh, but funny voice crying out very loud indeed, "Oh, my great-aunt! Oh, my great-aunt! Oh, my great-aunt!" A roar of laughter rose about him, almost lifting him off his feet, and close to his ear a voice sobbed, "Eh, my dear! Poor worm, poor worm!" He was aware then of a strong smell of oranges, of Uncle Samuel pushing him forward, of stumbling over boots, knees, and large hands that were clapping in his very nose, of falling into a seat, and then clinging to it as though it were his only hope in this strange, puzzling world. The high, funny voice rose again, "Oh, my great-aunt! Oh, my great-aunt!" And again it was followed by the roar of delighted laughter. He was aware then that about him on every side was gas sizzling, and then as he recovered slowly his breath, his gaze was drawn to the great blaze of light in the distance, against which figures were dimly moving, and from the heart of which the strange voice came. He heard a woman's voice, then several voices together, then suddenly the whole scene shifted into focus. His eyes were tied to the light, the oranges and the gas and the smell of clothes and heated bodies slipped back into the distance. He was caught into the world where he longed to be. He saw that it was a shop, and he loved shops. His heart beat thickly as his eyes travelled up and up and up over the rows and rows of shelves. Here were bales of clothes, and cloth red and green and blue, carpets from the east, table covers, sheets and blankets. Behind the long yellow counters, young men in strange clothes were standing. In the middle of the scene was a funny old woman, her hat tumbling off her head, her shabby skirt dragging, large boots and a red nose. It was from this strange creature that the deep, ugly voice proceeded. She had, this old woman, a number of bales of cloth under her arms, and she tried to carry them all, but one slipped, and then another, and then another. She bent to pick them up, and her hat fell off. She turned for her hat, and all the bales tumbled together. Jeremy began to laugh. Everyone laughed. The strange voice came again and again, lamenting, bewailing. She had secured one bale. A smile of cautious triumph began to spread over her ugly face. Then the bales all fell again, and once more she was on her knees. It was then that her voice, or some movement, brought to Jeremy's eyes so vividly the figure of their old gardener, Jordan, that he turned round to Uncle Samuel, and suddenly, grasping that gentleman's fat thigh, exclaimed convulsively, "Why, she's a man!" What a strange topsy-turvy world this was, in which women were men, and shops turned, as with a sudden creaking and darkness and clattering did this one, into gardens by the sea. Jeremy drew his breath deeply and held on. His mouth was open, and his hair on end. It is impossible to define exactly Jeremy's ultimate impression as the entertainment proceeded. Perhaps he had no ultimate impression. It cannot, in reality, have been a very wonderful pantomime. Even at Drury Lane, 30 years back, there were many things that they did not know, and it is not likely that a touring company, fitted into so inadequate an old building as our assembly rooms, would have provided anything very fine. But Jeremy will never again discover so complete a realization for his illusion. Whatever failures in the presentation there were, he himself made good. As a finale to the first half of the entertainment, there was given Dick's dream at the crossroads. He lay on the hard ground, his head upon his bundle, the cat as large as his watching sympathetically beside him. In the distance were the lights of London, and then, out of the half-dusk, fairies glittering with stars and silver, danced up and down the dusky road, whilst all the London bells rang out, "Turn again, Whittington, Lord Mayor of London." Had Jeremy been of the age and wisdom of Uncle Samuel, he would have discovered that Dick was a stout lady and probably the mother of a growing family, that the fairies knew as much about their dancing as the wives sitting on the bench behind, that the London bells were two hand instruments worked by a youth in shirt sleeves behind the scene so energetically that the high road and the painted London blew backwards and forwards in sympathy with the movements. Jeremy, happily, was not so worldly wise as his uncle. This scene created for him, then, a tradition of imperishable beauty that would never fade again. The world, after that night, would be a more magical place than it had ever been before. "Turn again, Dick Whittington," continued the education that the toy village and Hamlet had already advanced. When the gas rose once again, sizzling like crackling bacon, he was white with excitement. The only remark that he made was, "It's much better than the pictures outside Martin's, isn't it, Uncle Samuel?" To which Uncle Samuel, who had been railing for weeks at the deflowering of Polchester by those abominable posters, could truthfully reply, "Much better." Little by little he withdrew himself from the other world and realized his own. He could see that he and his uncle were certainly not amongst the quality large ladies, their dresses tucked up over their knees, sucked oranges. Country farmers with huge knobbly looking sticks were there, and even some sailors on their way probably to Drymouth. He recognized the lady who kept charge of the small orange street post office, and waved to her with delight. The atmosphere was thick with gas and oranges, and I'm afraid that Uncle Samuel must have suffered a great deal. I can only put it on record that he, the most selfish of human beings, never breathed a word of complaint. They were all packed very closely up there in the gallery, where 70 years before an orchestra straight from Jane Austen's novels had played to the dancing of the contemporaries of Elizabeth Bennet and the dear lady of Persuasion, another 32 years, and the same gallery would be listening to recruiting appeals and echoing the drums and fifes of a martial band. The best times are always the old times. The huge lady in the seat next to Jeremy almost swallowed him up, so that he peered out from under her thick arm and heard every crunch and crackle of the peppermints that she was enjoying. He grew hotter and hotter, so that at last he seemed, as once he had read in some warning tract about a greedy boy that Aunt Amy had given him, to swim in his own fat. But he did not mind. Discomfort only emphasized his happiness. Then, peering forward beneath the stout black arm, he suddenly perceived far below in the swimming distance the back of his mother, the tops of the heads of Mary and Helen, the stiff white collar of his father, and the well-known coral necklace of Aunt Amy. For a moment dismay seized him. The morning's lie, which he had entirely forgotten, suddenly jumped up and facing him. But they'd forgiven him. "Shall I wave to them?" he asked excitedly to Uncle Sam. "No, no," said the uncle very hurriedly. "Nonsense. They wouldn't see you if you did. Leave them alone." He felt immensely superior to them up where he was, and he wouldn't have changed places with them for anything. He gave a little sigh of satisfaction. "I could drop an orange onto Aunt Amy's head," he said. "Wouldn't she jump?" "You must keep quiet," said Uncle Samuel. "You're good enough as you are." "I'd rather be here," said Jeremy. "It's beautifully hot here, and there's a lovely smell." "There is," said Uncle Samuel. Then the gas went down and the curtains went up, and Dick, now in a suit of red silk with golden buttons, continued his adventures. I've not space here to describe in detail the further events of his life, how, receiving a telegram from the king of the Zanzibars about the plague of rats, he took ship with his cat and Alderman Fitzwarren and his wife, how they were all swallowed by a whale, cast up by most lucky chance on the Zanzibars, nearly cooked by the natives and rescued by the king of the Zanzibars. Beautiful daughter, killed all the rats, were given a huge feast with dance and song, and finally Dick, although tempted by the dusky princess, refused a large fortune and returned to Alice of Eastcheap, the true lady of his heart. There were, of course, many other things, such as the aspiration and misadventures of Mrs. Fitzwarren, the deep-voiced lady who had already so greatly amused Jeremy. And then there was a transformation scene in which roses turned into tulips, and tulips into the Hall of Gold, down whose blazing steps marched stout representatives of all the nations. It was in the middle of this last thrilling spectacle when Jeremy's heart was in his mouth, and he was so deeply excited that he did not know whether it were he or the lady next to him who was eating peppermints, that his uncle plucked him by the sleeve and said in his ear, "Come on, it's close to the end, we must go." Jeremy, very reluctantly, got up, stumbled out, over knees and legs. An exclamation like, "There's Japan! No, it ain't. It's China. Your face is beautiful, my hearty young woman," and so on. He was dragged through the black curtain, down the stone steps, and into the street. "But it wasn't the end," he said. "It will be in 1 minute," said his uncle. "And I want us to get home first." "Why?" said Jeremy. "Never you mind. Come on, we'll race it." They arrived home breathless. Then, once again, in the old familiar hall, Uncle Samuel said, "Now, you nip up to the nursery, and then they'll never know you've been out at all." "Never know?" said Jeremy. "But you said they'd sent for me." "Well," said Uncle Samuel, "that wasn't exactly true. As a matter of fact, they didn't know you were there." "Oh?" said Jeremy, the corner of his mouth turning down. "Then I've told a lie again." "Nonsense," said Uncle Samuel impatiently. "It wasn't you, it was I." "And doesn't it matter you're telling lies?" asked Jeremy. The answer to this difficult question was, happily for Uncle Samuel, interrupted by the arrival of the household, who had carried up Orange Street in a cab. When Mr. and Mrs. Cole saw Jeremy standing in the hall, with his great coat still on, and his muffler round his neck, there was a fine scene of wonder and amazement. Uncle Samuel explained, "It was my fault. I told him you'd forgiven him and sent for him to come after all. He's in an awful state now that you shouldn't forgive him." Whatever they thought of Uncle Samuel, this was obviously neither the time nor the place to speak out. Mrs. Cole looked at her son. His body, defiant, sleepy, excited. His mouth was obstinate, but his eyes appealed to her on the scene of the common, marvellous experience that they'd just enjoyed. She hugged him. "And you won't tell a lie again, will you, Jeremy dear?" "Oh, no," and then hurrying on, "And when the old woman tumbled down the steps, mother, wasn't it lovely? And the fairies in Dick Whittington's sleep, and when the furniture all fell over the place." He went slowly upstairs to the nursery, the happiest boy in the kingdom. Put through all his happiness was this puzzle. Uncle Samuel had told a lie, and no one had thought that it mattered. There were good lies and bad ones then. Or was it that grown-up people could tell lies and children mustn't? He tumbled into the warm, lighted nursery, half asleep. There was Hamlet watching in front of the jam-pot's sewing machine. He would have things to think about for years and years and years. There was the jam-pot. "I'm sorry I called you a beastly woman," he said. She sniffed. "Well, I hope you'll be a good boy now," she said. "Oh, I'll be good," he smiled. "But, nurse, are there some people can tell lies and others mustn't?" "All them that tell lies go to hell," said the jam-pot. "And now, Master Jeremy, come along and take your things off. It's past 11, and what you'll be like tomorrow."